You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen every kind of pain, every type of hardship that could walk through my courtroom doors. But on that cold Tuesday morning in March, a woman walked in carrying a burden so heavy, so unimaginably cruel, that it broke something inside me. What she told me about where she had been just 24 hours earlier, what had happened to her in the moment she should have been grieving, I still get tears in my eyes thinking about it. And when I heard the full story, when I understood what the universe had done to this poor soul, I had to make a decision that went beyond the law. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because this is a story about compassion, about humanity, and about what we owe each other when life delivers its cruelest blows. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this.
Before we go any further, pause for a second. 40 years on the bench means tens of thousands of cases, so when a veteran judge says this one still brings tears, you know we're not dealing with an ordinary parking ticket story. This is where law meets real life. And here's the question for you. Should justice always be strictly about rules, or should compassion sometimes change the outcome? Keep that in mind, because this case is about to test that line in a powerful way.
I've been a municipal court judge in Providence, Rhode Island since 1985. That's 40 years of seeing people on their worst days, 40 years of listening to stories that would break your heart or make you believe in the goodness of humanity all over again. Every morning I wake up at 5:30, I make my coffee strong and black, no sugar, just the way my father taught me when I was a girl. My father came to this country from Italy with nothing but $8 in his pocket and a dream that his children would have opportunities he never had. He worked construction his entire life, and he taught me something I've never forgotten. He said, when you have power over people, that's when your character is tested. Use it wisely. Use it with mercy. I get to the courthouse every morning at 8:15 sharp. My clerk, Christina, has been with me for 23 years, and she knows my routine better than I do. She has my case files organized on my desk. She knows I need those first few minutes with my coffee to center myself before I put on the robe, and she can read my mood just by the way I walk through the door. That Tuesday morning, March 14th, I remember walking in and feeling the cold seeping into my bones. It was one of those bitter New England mornings where the wind comes off the water and cuts right through you. Christina looked up when I came in and said good morning. She had that look on her face, the one she gets when she knows we have some tough cases ahead. I asked her what we had on the docket, and she handed me the files. Traffic violations mostly, a few parking disputes, nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. But she said something to me that I remember clearly. She said, Judge, there's one case this morning. The woman just lost her husband. Yesterday was the funeral. I looked at her and felt my chest tighten. I asked what she was cited for, and Christina told me it was a parking violation. I remember thinking to myself, this woman buried her husband yesterday, and today she has to come to court for a parking ticket? I sat down at my desk and went through the files. I saw her name, Sarah Mitchell, and I read the citation. It was issued the day after her husband's funeral, the day after. I felt anger rising in me, not at her, but at the cosmic cruelty of it all, at the timing, at the fact that in her darkest hour, she had to worry about a parking ticket and a court appearance. I made a note on her file. I wanted to hear her story directly. I wanted to look into her eyes and let her know that the law has room for compassion, that justice isn't just about rules. It's about understanding the human being standing before you. At 9:01, I walked into my courtroom. It's not a large room, not like you see on television with the soaring ceilings and marble columns. It's modest, functional, with rows of wooden benches where people wait for their cases to be called. The American flag stands to my right, and the state flag to my left. I've presided over thousands of cases in this room. I've seen people at their absolute worst and their surprising best. I've seen arrogance and humility, lies and raw honesty. And I've learned that every single person who walks through that door has a story, and that story matters. I looked out at the gallery that morning and saw maybe 20 people waiting. Some looked nervous, some looked annoyed, some looked resigned to their fate. My eyes moved across the faces until they landed on a woman sitting in the third row. She was alone. She wore a simple black dress and a cardigan that looked like it had been pulled on without much thought. Her hands were folded in her lap, And even from my bench, I could see she was trembling slightly. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless tears. I knew immediately this was Sarah Mitchell. I started calling cases. I handled a parking dispute between two neighbors who couldn't agree on whose car was over the line. I dealt with a speeding ticket for a young man who swore he was only going 5 over the limit. I listened to excuses and explanations, some genuine, some less so, and all the while I kept glancing at Sarah Mitchell, sitting there so still, so alone, like she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. At 10:45, Christina called her case. "Sarah Mitchell," she announced, and I watched the woman stand up slowly, like her legs weren't quite sure they would hold her. She walked to the front of the courtroom with small, careful steps. When she stood before my bench, she looked up at me, and I saw in her eyes a depth of pain I'll never forget. These weren't the eyes of someone worried about a fine. These were the eyes of someone who had lost everything. I looked down at the citation in front of me. I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I see here you've been cited for parking in a restricted zone on March 13th. Is that correct?" My voice was gentle. I wanted her to know from my tone that I wasn't here to make her day worse. She nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor," so quietly I could barely hear her. I asked her to tell me what happened, to explain the circumstances, and what she told me next, I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. She took a breath, and I could see her struggling to keep her composure. She said, "Your Honor, March 12th was my husband's funeral. We were married for 32 years. He had cancer. It took him in 6 months. Her voice cracked on that last word, and I saw tears start to stream down her face. She didn't wipe them away. She just stood there and let them fall. I felt my own throat tighten. I've heard thousands of stories in this courtroom, but there's something about a widow's grief that cuts through every defense you build up as a judge," she continued, and I could hear the effort it took for her to speak. "The funeral was at St. Mary's Church. My son drove in from Boston. My daughter came from Connecticut with her 2 children. We buried Michael at Swan Point Cemetery, the place where we used to walk on Sunday afternoons when things were good, when he was healthy." She stopped and closed her eyes, and I gave her time. I didn't rush her. In my courtroom, people get the time they need to tell their truth. "After the burial," she went on, "everyone came back to our house. My house. I can't call it our house anymore, can I?" She looked at me with such lost confusion that I felt my heart break a little. "People brought food. They told me stories about Michael. They meant well, but all I wanted was for everyone to leave so I could be alone with my grief. By evening, everyone was gone. My children wanted to stay, but I sent them home. I told them I needed to be alone." I leaned forward, listening to every word. I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm so sorry for your loss. Please take your time." She nodded and wiped her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her purse. "That night," she said, "I couldn't sleep. I couldn't be in our bedroom. Everything there reminded me of him. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his robe hanging on the back of the door. I couldn't breathe in there. So at 2 a.m, I got in my car and I just drove." I understood that immediately. I've been married for 48 years. I can't imagine losing my spouse. I can't imagine that kind of emptiness. I nodded for her to continue. "I drove to the places we used to go together," she said. "I drove past the restaurant where he proposed to me 40 years ago. I drove past the hospital where both our children were born. I drove past the park where we used to take them when they were little. And then I drove to the cemetery." She paused and took a shaky breath. "I parked outside the gates. They were closed, of course. It was 3 a.m, but I could see where we had buried him just hours before. I could see the fresh earth, and I sat in my car and I talked to him. I told him I didn't know how to do this without him. I told him I was scared. I told him I was sorry for every argument we ever had, for every time I was impatient or unkind. I told him I loved him." The courtroom was absolutely silent. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. I could hear someone in the back row sniffle quietly. "I don't know how long I sat there," Mrs. Mitchell said. "Maybe an hour, maybe 2. I lost track of time. When I finally looked up, the sun was starting to rise, and that's when I saw the parking enforcement officer writing me a ticket. I was parked in what I guess is a restricted zone right outside the cemetery gates. I got out of my car, and I tried to explain. I told him I had just buried my husband. I told him I wasn't thinking clearly, but he said he had to write the ticket. He said he was sorry, but rules are rules." I felt something hot surge through my chest, anger, pure and simple. Not at Mrs. Mitchell, at a system that could be so cruel, so inflexible in the face of human suffering. I looked down at the citation again. The parking enforcement officer's signature was there. The timestamp showed 5.
Now, here's something most people don't realize. In many municipal courts, judges actually have judicial discretion, meaning they can dismiss minor violations if enforcing them would be unfair or unreasonable under the circumstances. Parking tickets may look automatic, but the courtroom is where context matters. The officer followed procedure, but the judge must weigh justice. So the real tension right now is this: will the law be applied mechanically or humanely?
37 in the morning on March 13th, less than 12 hours after she had buried her husband. I looked back up at Mrs. Mitchell and I said, "Ma'am, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You buried your husband on March 12th. That night, overcome with grief, you drove to the cemetery in the early morning hours to be near him, and while you were sitting in your car grieving, trying to find a way to go on, you were given a parking ticket." She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered, "and the fine is $75. Which I know isn't a lot of money, but right now, with the funeral expenses and the medical bills we're still paying, it feels like a mountain." I sat back in my chair, and I had to take a moment. I've presided over thousands of cases. I've seen people try to manipulate the system, lie their way out of tickets, make up elaborate excuses for why the rules shouldn't apply to them. But I've also seen genuine hardship. I've seen people struggling against circumstances that would break most of us. And I've learned that my job isn't just to enforce the law mechanically. My job is to administer justice with wisdom and mercy. Now, let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever experienced a loss so profound that you couldn't think straight? Have you ever been in that place where grief takes over and you just need to be close to the person you lost? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're feeling this story, if it's touching you the way it touched me, hit that like button for me. I looked at Mrs. Mitchell standing there so small and fragile before my bench.
That moment right there is why courtroom stories resonate so deeply. It's not about $75, it's about validation. And grief psychology, even small acts of compassion, can become emotional turning points. Think about it. Have you ever had one stranger's kindness completely change your day or even your life? Drop a comment if you have. Because what just happened isn't just a legal decision, it's a reminder that empathy can echo far beyond the courtroom.
Thought about my own father's funeral 20 years ago. I remembered standing at his grave after everyone had left, not wanting to walk away because walking away meant accepting he was really gone. I remembered my spouse finding me there hours later, just standing in the cold, unable to move. I understood exactly what this woman had been going through. I made my decision in that moment. I picked up my gavel, but I didn't strike it yet. I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You did nothing wrong, nothing. You were a grieving widow seeking comfort in the only way you knew how. You were trying to feel close to your husband one more time. That is not a crime. That is not something that deserves punishment. That is human. That is what love looks like when it has nowhere else to go." I saw her eyes widen slightly. I saw hope flicker there for the first time since she'd walked into my courtroom. I continued, "This citation is dismissed. You owe nothing. Not $75, not 75 cents, not one single penny. You've paid enough. You've suffered enough. This court will not add to your burden." I brought the gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. Mrs. Mitchell stood there, and for a moment I wasn't sure she had understood me. Then I saw her shoulders begin to shake. The tears that had been falling quietly became sobs, deep, wrenching sobs that came from the very center of her grief. But I could see they were different now. They weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of feeling seen and understood in a moment when she probably felt completely alone in the world. Christina immediately stepped forward with a box of tissues. Mrs. Mitchell took several and pressed them to her face. I waited. I've learned over the years that sometimes people need a moment to let it all out, especially in a place where they thought they'd find more judgment and punishment. When she finally looked up at me, she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for seeing me as a person and not just a case number." I nodded to her and I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, you are not a case number. You are a woman who loved her husband for 32 years and lost him too soon. You are a mother and a grandmother doing her best to hold it together when everything is falling apart. That's who you are." I paused to make sure she was listening. "And I want you to know something else. Your husband would be very proud of you for coming here today, for facing this when I'm sure all you wanted to do was stay in bed and hide from the world. That takes courage. You honor his memory with that courage." She smiled through her tears, a small broken smile that somehow held a glimmer of light. "He always said I was stronger than I knew," she whispered. I smiled back at her. "He was right," I said. Now you go home. You take care of yourself. You lean on your children and your grandchildren, and you take all the time you need to grieve and heal. This court case is over." She thanked me again 3 or 4 times, and then she turned and walked back down the aisle. I watched her go, and I saw several people in the gallery reach out to touch her shoulder or hand as she passed. Small gestures of comfort from strangers who had witnessed something real and human in a courtroom. After she left, I sat there for a moment before calling the next case. I thought about the parking enforcement officer who had written that ticket. I understood he was doing his job. I understood that rules exist for a reason. But I also understood that rules without compassion become tyranny. Laws without mercy become oppression. My father taught me that. He said the letter of the law is important, but the spirit of the law is what matters. The spirit is about fairness, about decency, about recognizing that we're all human and we all stumble and fall sometimes. About 3 weeks later, I was in my chambers going through some paperwork when Christina came in with an envelope. She said, "Judge, this came for you." I looked at the return address and saw it was from Sarah Mitchell. I opened it carefully and pulled out a handwritten letter on simple stationery. The handwriting was shaky but legible. I want to read you part of what she wrote because it meant more to me than almost anything I've received in my career. She wrote, "Dear Judge Judy, I hope you don't mind me writing to you. I wanted you to know what your kindness meant to me. The morning I came to your courtroom, I honestly didn't know if I could go on. I was drowning in grief and overwhelmed by all the things I suddenly had to handle alone. When that officer gave me the parking ticket while I sat at my husband's grave, it felt like the universe was telling me it didn't care about my pain, that I still had to follow all the rules even though my world had ended. I went to court that day expecting more of the same, more cold bureaucracy, more being treated like a number. But you saw me. You really saw me. You understood. And when you dismissed that ticket, it wasn't really about the $75. It was about someone in a position of authority telling me I wasn't crazy, I wasn't wrong, my grief mattered. You gave me permission to be human in my darkest hour. I will never forget that." I had to stop reading for a moment. I took off my glasses and wiped my eyes. I'm not ashamed to tell you I cried reading that letter. After 40 years on the bench, you'd think I'd have thicker skin, but I don't. I don't ever want thicker skin if it means I stop feeling the weight and the gift of this work. About 6 months after I dismissed Mrs. Mitchell's ticket, I was at the grocery store on a Saturday morning doing the shopping. I was in the produce section trying to figure out which avocados were ripe when I heard someone say, "Judge Judy." I turned around and saw Sarah Mitchell standing there with her shopping cart. She looked different than she had in my courtroom. She still had sadness in her eyes, that kind of sadness that never fully leaves after you lose someone you love. But she also looked lighter somehow, like she'd found a way to carry the weight. I smiled and said hello. She came over and took my hand. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, "not just for dismissing the ticket, but for treating me like I mattered. I've thought about that day so many times, about your kindness. It helped me more than you know." I told her I was just doing my job the way it should be done. She shook her head. "No," she said, "you did it the way it should be done. Most people just do their job. There's a difference." We talked for a few minutes there in the produce section. She told me her daughter had just had another baby, her 3rd grandchild. She told me she'd gone back to work part-time as a librarian. She told me she'd started volunteering at a grief support group, helping other people who were walking the path she'd walked. "I figured if I could help someone else the way you helped me," she said, "maybe some good could come from all this pain." I felt my eyes get misty right there next to the avocados. This woman who had stood in my courtroom 6 months earlier, barely able to speak through her tears, was now using her pain to help others. That's the resilience of the human spirit. That's what we're capable of when we're treated with dignity and compassion instead of coldness and bureaucracy. Before we parted ways, she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Judge, you gave me back my faith that day. Faith that the world isn't all cruel. Faith that there are still people who care. Faith that I could get through this. Thank you for that gift." I hugged her right there in the store, something I rarely do, but it felt like the right thing in that moment. When we stepped back, we were both crying a little, and I didn't care who saw. Look, I need to ask you for a favor. If this story is resonating with you, if you're seeing the importance of compassion in our legal system, I need you to share this. Send it to someone who works in law enforcement or the courts. Send it to someone who's going through grief. Send it to someone who needs to be reminded that there are still good people trying to do the right thing. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the other stories I'm going to share, and leave me a comment telling me what you think. Do you think I did the right thing? Would you have done the same? About a year after dismissing the ticket, I was honored by the Bar Association for my years of service. It was a nice ceremony, a lot of kind words, a plaque from my office. At the reception afterward, a woman approached me who I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized it was Sarah Mitchell. She was wearing a beautiful blue dress and she had color in her cheeks. She looked like a person who had found her way back to life. She told me she'd read about the ceremony in the paper and wanted to come thank me in person one more time. But she also wanted to tell me something. She said, "Judge, I started a scholarship fund in my husband's name. It's for people who are facing financial hardship due to medical bills or funeral expenses. We raised enough money to give out 3 scholarships this year to help people pay their bills and get back on their feet. And I want you to know the inspiration for that fund was you. The kindness you showed me, I wanted to pass it on. I wanted to multiply it. I was speechless. This woman had taken the compassion I'd shown her and turned it into something that would help countless other people. She'd taken her pain and transformed it into purpose. She'd taken the mercy she received and magnified it. That's the power of compassion. It doesn't just help the immediate recipient. It creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond what we can see or measure. I hugged her again and I told her how proud I was of her, how her husband would be proud, how she was honoring his memory in the most beautiful way. She smiled and said, "I learned from the best. I don't think I'm the best, not by a long shot, but I'm grateful that something I did on one random Tuesday morning ended up creating something so meaningful. That scholarship fund is still operating today, 5 years later. It's helped dozens of families who are drowning in medical debt or funeral costs. It's kept people in their homes. It's allowed parents to keep feeding their children. It's prevented financial catastrophe for people who were hanging on by a thread. And it all started because I chose compassion over bureaucracy in my courtroom one morning." That's what I mean when I say our small choices matter. Whether you're a judge or a teacher, a police officer or a parent, a boss or a friend, you have power in people's lives. You have the ability to make their day better or worse, to see them or ignore them, to show compassion or withhold it. Choose carefully, choose wisely, choose with your heart as well as your head, because those choices ripple out in ways you'll never fully see. They shape lives, they change trajectories, they teach lessons, they create the world we all have to live in. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in justice tempered with mercy like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. And that law should be applied with wisdom, with discretion, and with compassion, because we're not just enforcing rules, we're serving justice, and justice without mercy isn't really justice at all. It's just punishment, and punishment alone has never healed anyone or made the world better. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you. Take care of each other. Show kindness whenever you can, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.